Thank you very much for being here this morning. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome you here to the Fallen Officer Memorial Service. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome and recognize a few dignitaries that are here with us this morning. Mayor Biskupski, thank you for being here. Patrick Leary, Chief of Staff, thank you. U.S. Attorney John Huber, thank you. We have our Community Advisory Board. Thank you, members, for being here and supporting us this morning. Robert Kirby, thank you. And last but not least, all the women and men of the Salt Lake City Police Department, thank you for being here this morning. This means a lot to us and our fallen officers. Before we get started, we're going to have an opening prayer by Chaplain Mel Ward. Following that, we will have the presentation of the colors by the Motor and the Explorer Honor Guard, and the national anthem will be sung by Detective Richard Chipping. We'll proceed to that point.
Gracious and loving Heavenly Father, as the morning breaks and the shadows flee, we come to Thee with a prayer of thanksgiving. Grateful we are for our lives, our families, for the community, for the freedoms of thought and action, for the bounties and opportunities of this great nation. May our thoughts and actions reflect our gratitude for all these blessings. We're mindful of the shifting values of the civil unrest, the social and political turmoil so painfully evident here at home and throughout much of the world. Bless each of us with a realization of our personal responsibility to live lives worthy of the favors that we seek. Forgive us our trespasses as we strive to implement the saving message of Thy beloved Son. We are mindful of those who now and in the past have put themselves in harm's way to protect and defend these precious values and freedoms. Today, we particularly honor those who have given their last full measure of devotion to this great experiment of democracy. May we forever remember them and their selfless sacrifice in our behalf. And now may the spirit of appreciation and remembrance infuse this ceremony of honor and reflection. This is our humble prayer. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, amen.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Honor Guard. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for being here this morning, for showing up and taking time out of their busy day to pay tribute and respect to our fallen officers. On September 18th, 2001, I found myself on the eastbound lanes of I-80. I was at a horrific traffic crash. I stood there with several officers as we said a prayer. We said a prayer for our friend Jim Ferroni. Jim had been involved in a terrible traffic accident. As we watched life flight land, Jim was loaded into the helicopter and taken away. Unfortunately, Jim did not survive this crash. The injuries were just too great. As I surveyed the scene, I remember looking across the freeway, and there were dozens and dozens of shoes all over the highway. And in my mind, I just could not figure out why those shoes were there. I remember walking up to Jim's patrol car, the mangled, tangled metal that was just horribly crushed, and in the trunk of his car were more shoes. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized that Jim was collecting shoes to send to his son Adam, who was serving a mission in Peru. So Jim served this police department with not only honor and integrity, respect, but the final chapter of Jim's life, although cut short, the final verse, the final sentence, was one of compassion. Policing is compassion. Compassion is policing. Jim embodied compassion. And I'm very sure that the 23 other officers that have gave their lives in service to this community, compassion was one of their driving forces. Let us not remember Jim or any of these fallen officers for just how they died, but for how they lived and how they served this community. Embodying the core values of our department: character, compassion, community service, communication, and courage. The Salt Lake City Police Department has a long-standing tradition of serving the largest city in the state with honor and integrity. I am humbled to be here to honor those who gave everything, to live our lives and work in a way that pays tribute to the fallen. Only with that in mind can we go out and commit to serve with humility and compassion. I'd like to now turn the time over to Robert Kirby as he does a roll call of our fallen officers and the pinning of the wreath.
The first officer to lose his life in service to the city of Salt Lake was Officer William Cook. He was killed October 18th, 1858. On the afternoon of October 13th, Officer Cook was on duty alone at the city jail. Two men came to the jail at 100 South and State Street and demanded the release of an inmate. When he refused, one of the men shot him in the thigh. Officer Cook died 5 days later. Although the killer fled the city, he was shot and killed October 21st, 1858, near Fort Bridger, Wyoming, by a Salt Lake mail carrier who was familiar with the murder. Officer Cook, 55, was married and the father of 6 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Chief Andrew H. Burt was killed in the line of duty August 25th, 1883. Chief Burt was murdered by a deranged man in downtown Salt Lake City. Accompanied by the city watermaster, Burt was searching for a suspect who had earlier threatened the life of a local merchant. When they found the suspect at 200 South Main, he shot Chief Burt with a .45-70 caliber rifle. The city watermaster was also wounded, but managed to disarm the suspect, who was immediately captured. Marshal Burt, 54, was married and the father of a large number of children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Sergeant Alonzo M. Wilson, killed in the line of duty April 12, 1894. Sergeant Wilson died from an accidental gunshot wound while working as the morning desk sergeant in the Salt Lake City Police Station, located at 100 South State Street. A new patrolman dropped a loaded pistol that discharged as it hit the floor. The bullet struck Wilson in the right knee, shattering his femur. He was taken to the hospital, where the leg was amputated. During the surgery, doctors discovered that the bullet had ranged up into his torso. He died approximately 5 hours after being shot. Sergeant Wilson, 54, was married and the father of 6 children, one of whom later became a Salt Lake City police officer. A few hours after his death, his wife gave birth to their 7th child. He is buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Salt Lake City. Officer Charles S. Ford, killed in the line of duty September 14, 1907. Officer Ford was shot and killed following the armed robbery of a Salt Lake City bar. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Ford was working his 3rd shift after returning to law enforcement from a 16-year absence. He was standing on the northeast corner of 600 South and 200 West when 2 armed robbers, fleeing the scene of a robbery in the Albany Hotel bar across the street, shot him. Officer Ford returned fire without effect. He died 12 hours later at St. Mark's Hospital. The 2 suspects managed to flee Utah. One was arrested in Portland a month later. The second was shot to death by Seattle officers in May 1908. The first robber was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For health reasons, his sentence was terminated in 1918. He died several months later. Officer Ford, 51, was married and the father of 2 grown daughters. He is buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery. Officer Charles C. Riley. Officer Riley was shot and killed while escorting a suspect to jail in Salt Lake City. A reserve officer, Riley had located 2 suspects wanted in connection with an armed robbery that occurred just minutes before. Officer Riley and his prisoners were walking northbound on State Street at approximately 180 South when one of the men produced a pistol and shot the officer twice. The crime occurred in full view of a large crowd of patrons at the Orpheum Theater. The men fled, but the shooter was later captured and convicted of first-degree murder. He was paroled in 1920. Officer Riley, 34, was married and the father of a young daughter. He is buried in Salt Lake City Cemetery. Sergeant John Henry Johnson, killed in the line of duty July 8, 1911. Sergeant Johnson died of a gunshot wound suffered in an incident that occurred 3 days earlier. In the early morning hours of July 5th, Johnson and 2 other officers responded to a domestic disturbance in a room at the Albert Hotel, 119 Southwest Temple. Officers discovered an intoxicated man threatening his wife with a revolver. When Sergeant Johnson stepped between the couple, the sergeant shot him once in the abdomen. The man was attempting to shoot Johnson again when other officers subdued him. He was transported to St. Mark's Hospital, where he died. The suspect was charged with first-degree murder, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. 2 years later, after the Utah Supreme Court ordered a new trial, the suspect pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was paroled in 1917. Sergeant Johnson was 42, married, and the father of 2 children. He is buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery, Salt Lake City. Officer Thomas F. Griffiths, killed in the line of duty June 25, 1913. Officer Griffiths responded to a call near 250 West, 200 South, where he arrested a suspect for assault. While headed to a nearby call box, the suspect broke away and fled. Griffiths pursued the suspect behind a business where he was shot 3 times. The suspect was arrested and imprisoned, but he escaped in 1919, never to be recaptured. Griffiths, 39, was married and the father of 6 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Detective Green B. Hamby, killed in the line of duty February 8, 1921. Detective Hamby died after being shot by a burglary suspect. Acting on a tip, he and other officers went to the Nord Hotel at 59.5 East, 200 South. While attempting to gain access to a room where the men had been staying, Detective Hamby was shot in the head by a 4th suspect hiding inside. The suspect was killed by return fire from other officers. Detective Hamby, 49, was married and had 3 children, including one who was a Salt Lake City police officer. Detective Hamby is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Sergeant Nephi Pierce, killed in the line of duty March 26, 1923. Sergeant Pierce died from the effects of a gunshot wound inflicted 4 months earlier by an armed robbery suspect. Shortly after midnight on November 27th, Sergeant Pierce and Officer George Watson were on foot patrol near 525 South Main Street. As they attempted to question 2 men matching the descriptions of a pair of robbery suspects, one of the suspects drew a gun. Sergeant Pierce sought cover behind a tree, where the suspect shot him once in the abdomen. Officer Watson was then pistol whipped and left for dead. The 2 suspects were captured the following morning. Officer Watson recovered, but Sergeant Pierce's spine was severed, and the assailants were convicted of assault and sent to prison. When Sergeant Pierce died 4 months later, the shooter was convicted of murder and executed by firing squad, February 20th, 1925. The second suspect was paroled in 1926. Sergeant Pierce, 54, was married and had no children. He is buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery. Officer David H. Crowther, killed October 12, 1923. Officer Crowther was shot to death by a transient. A search was launched when he failed to return home from patrol the previous night. At 10 a.m., the body of the 45-year-old officer was found on a bank of the Jordan River 3 blocks from his home. On October 16, 1923, 3 men driving Officer Crowther's blood-stained vehicle were arrested in Ludlow, California. The men were extradited to Utah, charged and tried, and found guilty of robbery and murder. 2 of the men were eventually paroled. The suspect who shot Officer Crowther was executed at the Utah State Prison in 1926. Crowther was married and the father of 3 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Officers Brigham H. Honey, Jr. and William Nolan Huntsman, killed in the line of duty February 16, 1924. Officers Honey and Huntsman were gunned down by robbery suspects. At 11:30 p.m. Saturday, February 16, 1924, Officers William Huntsman and Officers Brigham Honey heard a shot fired outside the State Cafe, 46 West Broadway. Both officers pursued the suspect to 337 South Main, and a gun battle ensued. Huntsman was killed immediately while Honey died several hours later. The suspect committed suicide at the scene. Huntsman 26 and Honey 34 are buried near each other in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Officer Gustav J. Gus Lund, killed August 25, 1924. Officer Lund died after being struck by a truck in the intersection of 1100 East and 2100 South. Lund was directing noontime traffic when he stepped between the truck and a trailer it was towing. He died instantly. Lund, 61, was married and the father of 10 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Officer Carl J. Carlson, killed March 9th, 1929. Officer Carlson was killed by injuries sustained in a liquor raid. Carlson and fellow officers raided a building at 23 Southwest Temple, where they located several barrels of mash. One of the 50-gallon barrels fell on Officer Carlson's foot, causing him to jump back and strike his head against the wall. Following treatment for the foot injury at the hospital, Officer Carlson attended a wrestling exhibition. There he was found semi-conscious, clinging to a lamppost. Taken to the hospital, he died the following morning of a basal skull fracture received while striking his head. Officer Carlson, 39, was married and the father of 6 children. He is buried at Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park. Officer Blaine L. Baxter, killed September 4th, 1935. Officer Baxter was killed in a motorcycle accident while enforcing speed limits in Salt Lake City. He was conducting routine speed enforcement on 200 West between 200 and 300 North when he observed a vehicle traveling south at a high rate of speed. He initiated a pursuit. At the intersection of 100 North, 200 West, a vehicle turned in front of the officer. Baxter lost control of his motorcycle while taking evasive action and crashed into the wall of a building. He suffered a broken neck and died at the local hospital. He was married and the father of 2 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Sergeant Thomas W. Stroud, killed January 5th, 1951. Sergeant Stroud was accidentally killed at the Salt Lake City Police Station. At 6:30 p.m., Stroud and another officer were preparing for a department-sponsored children's party. As the 2 officers were loading a vehicle which was located at 100 South State Street, Sergeant Stroud's pistol fell from his waistband and struck the sidewalk. The weapon discharged and the officer was shot through the heart, killing him instantly. Officer Stroud, 34, was married and the father of 2 sons. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Sergeant Owen T. Farley, killed in the line of duty May 23, 1951. Sergeant Farley was shot and killed by a robbery suspect. After arresting a man and woman in possession of a car that investigators believed was used in a robbery in Ogden, Farley transported them to the police headquarters for questioning. As the sergeant pulled away from the curb at 260 South State, the male suspect produced a gun and shot him in the stomach. Farley died a short time later at a local hospital. Farley, 37, was married and the father of 3 children. He is buried in the Heber City Cemetery. Officer Harold A. Peterson. Officer Peterson was killed in a traffic accident October 27, 1954. At approximately 10 a.m., Peterson was patrolling on his 3-wheeled motorcycle. As he entered the intersection of 1300 South and 1300 East, a vehicle driven by an elderly man turned in front of him. The collision knocked Officer Peterson from his motorcycle, dragged him more than 30 feet, and pinned him beneath the vehicle. He died of severe head trauma. Peterson, 34, was married and the father of a son who would go on to become a Salt Lake City police officer. He is buried at Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park, Salt Lake County. Detective Percy L. Clark, killed in the line of duty January 11th, 1973. Detective Clark was shot and killed during an armed robbery. During a stakeout at 564 3rd Avenue, two suspects arrived to rob a pharmacy. As they exited, the detective called for their surrender. One suspect opened fire, striking Detective Clark in the head. Officers returned fire, killing the shooter. The second suspect surrendered. Detective Clark, 42, was married and the father of 7 children. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Detective David W. Olson died as a result of performing his duty March 22, 1980. Detective Olson joined the police department in October 1971. A combat veteran of the Vietnam War, Olson served the department in patrol, canine, and special investigations. He was known to his close friends as Hagar. In the early morning hours of April 3, 1977, Olson, while in the performance of his duties, was accidentally wounded. As a result, he was unable to return to active duty and died March 22, 1980. Sergeant Ronald L. Heaps, killed in the line of duty January 13, 1982. Corporal Heaps was shot and killed while investigating a suspicious person call. At approximately 9:25, Heaps and 2 other officers responded to the area of 1300 South, 300 East. They contacted the occupants of a motorhome, unaware that one of them was wanted for the October 2nd, 1981 murder of California Highway Patrol Officer John Martinez. When officers inquired about the ownership of the motorhome, the wanted suspect produced a stolen 9mm pistol and began firing. Officer Heaps was struck between the panels of his body armor and died within a few minutes. Although wounded, the second officer shot and killed the assailant. Another suspect attempting to flee the area was shot and killed by the third officer. Heaps, 32, was married and the father of 4 children. Posthumously promoted to sergeant, he is buried in the Alpine City Cemetery. Officer Michael J. Dunman, killed in the line of duty July 17, 2000. Officer Dunman was struck and killed by a motorist. Dunman was on afternoon bike patrol at 1500 South State when a vehicle jumped the curb and struck him from behind. The officer suffered massive head injuries and died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Following an investigation, the suspect was charged with negligent homicide. An earlier drug charge was also reactivated. Regardless, he secured bail and subsequently fled the country. Mike, 30, was married and the father of 3 children. He is buried in the Bountiful City Cemetery. Sergeant James E. Ferroni, killed September 18, 2001. Sergeant Ferroni was killed in a traffic accident on Interstate 80. Shortly after 2:30 p.m., Ferroni encountered a disabled vehicle in the middle of the eastbound lanes at approximately 3800 West. He parked his unmarked patrol unit behind the disabled vehicle and activated his red and blue strobe lights. While seated behind the wheel, Ferroni's car was struck from behind by a pickup traveling at a high rate of speed. Although wearing his seatbelt, the officer died almost instantly from massive chest trauma caused by the steering column. Jim, 48, is survived by his wife and 2 children. He is buried at Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park, Salt Lake County. Detective James W. Colley, killed March 29, 2003. Detective Colley was killed in Iraq on Saturday, March 29, 2003, defending the freedom he so cherished. He was serving as a Marine reservist and staff sergeant of the 1st Platoon Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marine Regiment. After 12 years of active duty with the Marines, Colley joined the Salt Lake City Police Department on April 10, 1997. He served honorably as an officer, a detective in the gang suppression unit, and a member of the SWAT team. Whether serving as a police officer on the home front or a Marine in faraway land, Detective Colley was willing to sacrifice his life in the name of peace, safety, and justice. His life revolved around serving others, and that service can best be summed up by the words inscribed at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. It is not how these officers died that made them heroes, it is how they lived. Colley, 41, is survived by his wife and 2 young children. He is buried in the Roy City Cemetery. Thank you.
The audience, please rise. Officers, attention. Precinct 1.
Thank you, Robert Kirby. Thank you for doing that. Salt Lake City SWAT, thank you for the 21-gun salute. Explorer Vieira, thank you. And the bagpipes, Ian Williams, thank you very much. We're now honored and it's a privilege to hear from Mayor Biskupski.
Thank you for being here this morning. This is a time for reflection. This morning we gather to pay homage to our city's fallen officers. In this solemn task, we join people from around our nation as we celebrate National Police Week. It may seem easy for people like me, political leaders, to come to these ceremonies and speak of sacrifice and gratitude. But when I think of what is truly sacrificed and what is actually given up, when the ultimate price is paid, it brings me pause and reflection. Sorry. What comes to mind is love, hope, the hope given by our officers, touch, laughter, friendship, family, and the family in blue. The totality of what these 24 officers of Salt Lake City Police Department should humble us all. As we go about our day, let us consider what we would sacrifice to serve those we do not know, and be awed by what some have given and some would give up for us today, tomorrow, and in the future. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much for those beautiful words, Mayor Biskupski. At this time, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize retired Captain Judy Danker. Thank you, Judy, for the many, many years of keeping our history. Lieutenant Mike Ross, who is our department historian, and Robert Kirby, thank you for all you do for our police department so that we can remember our fallen, because it is our pledge to our fallen that we will never forget.